This is Malaysia, a country born only a year and a half ago and under attack for nearly her whole lifetime. Malaysia is fighting constant harassment with the help of Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. The enemy, powerful Indonesia, with whom she shares 1,000 miles of border. This struggle has brought another pocket of nastiness to the east and the possibility of a crippling blow to the United Nations. Good evening. My name is Peter Riley. In less than 20 years, the passion, the wit, and the lust for power of one man has turned a former Dutch colony into a unified, independent country consisting of 3,000 islands and over 100 million people. Indonesia, the sixth most populous country in the world. The man, President Sukarno, president, a powerful man who wants more power. And because he does, another crisis is building in Asia, and the United Nations is facing what Canada believes to be the most grievous problem since the crisis in Cuba 3 years ago. In the studio tonight, the CBC's Far Eastern correspondent, Tom Gould, with the background.
President Sukarno has an international reputation for being irrational and irresponsible. He has been totally ruthless in his efforts to expand his island empire. In 1962, he added 160,000 square miles to Indonesian territory by bulldozing the Dutch out of the western half of New Guinea. He accomplished this land grab by sending paratroopers into the Dutch colony, running gunboats on forays off the coast, and by creating a diplomatic storm in the United Nations. Pushed by the United States, the Dutch gave up and got out. Now President Sukarno wants to swallow Malaysia. His grand design is obvious. He wants an empire that will reach from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. He has already given that empire a name, Mathalindo, from Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia. Having won West New Guinea from the Dutch, he is already probing at the Australian mandate of East New Guinea. The Australians, in their concern, have imposed conscription to raise an army for its defense and for the defense of Malaysia. Among other things, President Sukarno wants to control the Straits of Malacca, the narrow trade route between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. For centuries, this has been the principal ship route between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. President Sukarno's military campaign against Malaysia began 1 year ago. He has sent gunboats across the straits to land guerrilla fighters on the peninsula. His navy has interfered with Malaysian coastal shipping and with its fishing fleet. In Borneo, he has sent trained infiltrators across the Malaysian border into the straits of Sarawak and Sabah. The heart of Malaysia's defense is the huge British naval base at Singapore, a base strategically located at the entrance to the straits. At Singapore and in the Malaysian capital of Kuala Lumpur, government and military officials have undertaken a major buildup of troops and ships in readiness to repel Indonesian assaults. And from the Indonesian capital of Jakarta, President Sukarno hurls out his threats to crush Malaysia. Although many Indonesians live at a subsistence level and Indonesia has no apparent external enemies, President Sukarno has steadily built up his nation's armed forces. He now has at least 250,000 men under arms, and that's considered a conservative estimate. The Indonesian armed forces are equipped primarily with Russian weapons, but in recent months, the huge Communist Party in Indonesia, with the membership estimated at almost 3 million, has been pushing Sukarno steadily toward closer relations with Communist China. The Russians are fast losing their influence, and there is a steady flow of friendly visits between Jakarta and Peking. While he was wooing the Russians, Sukarno managed to talk Moscow into giving him 100 MiG fighters and some old medium bombers. The Russians equipped his navy with a heavy cruiser, many small gunboats, and about 20 submarines. Despite the continuing crisis of their country's short history, most Indonesians seem to go along with the president, and it's been a number of years since there was a threat to his leadership. Military officials in Washington and Singapore discount any possibility of a major invasion of Malaysia. They say Sukarno's navy is short of landing craft, but in fact he has only half a dozen small craft capable of landing troops on the Malay Peninsula. What most people expect now is a continuation of the campaign of infiltration by small bands of guerrillas. These guerrillas have been landing in Malaysia for the better part of a year with, to them, devastating results. Almost everyone has been captured or killed. In Singapore, bombs have exploded, but with little effect, and in general, President Sukarno has failed in his campaign. Sukarno's shock troops are saboteurs and terrorists. Some of them are Malaysians who train in Indonesia, then return to their homeland to set bombs and explosives, hoping to create a climate of instability. The landing of infiltrators on Malaysian soil has brought this type of warning from senior police officials in Singapore.
Persons who live in the adjacent islands and in the coastal areas of Singapore should notify the police at once of the presence of strangers who land on the shore and are observed handling or unloading goods or packages in a secret or furtive manner. The unusual arrival and departure of small craft should also be reported to the police.
The British have pledged their full support to Malaysia. British ships patrol the straits, checking hundreds of small craft, and there has been a major buildup of British naval strength at the Singapore base. The Royal Navy maintains about 80 ships in Southeast Asian waters. One aircraft carrier is already in the area. A second is steaming to Singapore from Mombasa on the east coast of Africa. Patrol ships have had a number of clashes with Indonesian vessels, but in any major engagement, the Indonesians would be badly outgunned. For the most part, the confrontation takes place at small outposts in the jungle. Small groups of Indonesian guerrillas slip through the border or are landed on the beaches, and British and Malaysian troops relentlessly hunt them down. There are about 20,000 men in Malaysia's young army. Under the increased threat, mobilization is underway. The equipment is provided by the British, but the Australians and the New Zealanders are aiding in the training program. They, too, say Sukarno must be stopped in his tracks. Much of the country is wild jungle. Troops take to the hundreds of small rivers in boats. Most of the Malaysian troops are infantry. They are well trained in jungle warfare. British and Malaysian troops have received overwhelming support from the Malaysian citizenry. Some of the troops fought with the British during Malaya's brutal campaign to wipe out communism. There is much that reminds one of the war in South Vietnam. The helicopter is used extensively to land troops in the jungle. Frequently, it's the only way to reach the point of infiltration. Malaysia has already asked the British to send more helicopters to the area. Many of the troops are Gurkhas, mercenaries who have been fighting Britain's wars in Asia and elsewhere for decades. The Gurkhas' favorite weapon is a long-bladed knife, and at least some of President Sukarno's infiltrators have surrendered rather than face them in battle. Prisoners are said to talk readily. British officers say the Indonesians appear to be poorly trained and poorly equipped. Some of them have been near starvation when picked up. Their weapons are Russian, Chinese, and Czech, but some of them carry the FN rifle, the Belgian weapon used by NATO forces in Europe. Indonesia makes no secret of her aggressive moves against Malaysia. She calls the infiltrators volunteers. The volunteers have created more than 200 incidents over the past year. Malaysian and British casualties now total 100 dead or wounded, and Malaysian authorities say 500 Indonesians have been killed or captured. This ratio of 5 to 1 has not been found pleasing to President Sukarno. The morale of his volunteers is not high, and the British and Malaysian troops are getting great support from the citizens of Malaya who report every landing. In one typical incident on December 27th, 9 armed Indonesians landed on Singapore Island. They carried Sten guns and hand grenades. By the afternoon of December 29th, 7 of the 9 had been captured. All of their weapons were captured with them. In another recent incident on December 23rd, 28 Indonesians landed on the peninsula. By evening of the same day, 25 of them had been captured.
Then at the new year, President Sukarno piled yet another burden on the UN by threatening to pull out when his arch enemies got a place on the Security Council for 2 years. There's still some confusion here about whether he actually means it, but if he does, his country will be the first to leave the UN in its 20-year history. The circumstances surrounding the move were, to say the very least, strange. Here's the background. Ever since it began last month, the General Assembly has been afraid to put anything to the vote. The reason is a financial dispute involving Russia, France, and a number of other countries, in which the United States has threatened to challenge the right of the Soviet Union to vote. So everything, including the choice of 3 non-permanent Security Council members, has been done by gentleman's agreement until now. And on December the 29th, when Malaysia was chosen for the Security Council in precisely that way, the Indonesian delegate, Mr. Pilar, gave every indication of going along even though he didn't like it very much.
3 abstentions, and there were even 10 delegations who, despite the gentleman agreement between Czechoslovakia and Malaysia, voted for Czechoslovakia's opponent, Malaysia. Finally, Mr. President, although we have our reservations, we wish to cooperate. We wish to cooperate in order to enable the President to carry out the procedure he has just proposed.
But it was only a couple of days later, New Year's Eve in North America, when Mr. Sukarno fired off his resentful salvo from Jakarta. Indonesia was leaving the UN. Then Mr. Pilar had to change his tune. The decision to withdraw from the body, he said, was absolutely final.
The United Nations is an organization that has been established later, and that the situation is quite different from the time when the League of Nations existed.
But don't you think all nations should belong to the United Nations if there's going to be peace in the world?
Well, the fact is that certain countries can be compelled to leave the United Nations, as we are doing now.
You're being compelled. You mean compelled because of Malaysia's seat on the Security Council?
That's right.
Or its actions in Southeast Asia?
Well, what has happened now and what we have said is that we are pulling out because Malaysia has been elected by the United Nations to become member of the Security Council. Okay.
So the UN, which virtually staggered to the end of the year, pestered by financial troubles and a bilious attack of anti-white racism over the Congo, faced the new year with the prospect of a sharp kick in the prestige. The news brought comment immediately. Most of it, like that from U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, was regretful.
That Indonesia has decided to withdraw from the United Nations. I earnestly hope that this great country will not do so, for it is in the manifest interest of the Indonesian people and of all peoples to preserve and to improve the system of collective responsibility, to harmonize international relations, and to preserve the peace. No nation can profit in the long run from a lawless world of separate states, each pursuing its own sovereign ambitions. That way lies catastrophe. Fortunately, most of the world agrees and loyally adheres to the United Nations system of international security and development. I repeat that I hope very much that the great Indonesian people will continue to do so too.
Secretary General of the United Nations, U Thant, wired President Sukarno to ask for a change of heart. 1965 is International Cooperation Year, he pointed out, and this is really no way to start it off. And the President of the General Assembly, Alex Kwesinsaki of Ghana, also begged Sukarno to reconsider. UN staffers pointed out privately that there is still some hope. The resignation is only verbal. Tonight, there's still nothing in writing, but there's nothing in the book that says there has to be. No one's ever quit before. The American position in the situation has been anomalous. It doesn't want to see the UN fly apart, but on the other hand, it's been giving a certain amount of support to Sukarno. Here's Knowlton Nash, CBC's Washington correspondent, to talk on that subject.
The Americans basically think that the Indonesians are bluffing. They do not believe that Indonesia will formally withdraw from the United Nations, but will leave things in a rather fuzzy state for some time, and then probably slowly resume their relationship with the UN. Actually, there's no provision in the UN Charter to formally withdraw, but the Washington lawyers believe that if President Sukarno so wished, he could send a letter to the Secretary General citing a clause in the report of the Charter Drafting Committee in 1945, which said a nation would not be forced to cooperate with the UN if it did not wish to do so. Washington has been having its own troubles with Mr. Sukarno for quite some time now. It was a few months ago that, while vigorously making an anti-American speech, President Sukarno turned to the American ambassador, who was sitting on the platform listening, and told him, "To hell with American aid." This hardly went down very well with Washington, and in fact, the United States is now providing very little aid to Indonesia, something like $10 million a year for such things as an anti-malaria program. Originally, the U.S. government was quite high on President Sukarno, even used the nickname of calling him the George Washington of his country. But this approval turned to suspicion and dislike as Mr. Sukarno took an increasingly anti-American line and became much more friendly with the Chinese. Nowadays, Washington tends to look upon the Indonesian leader as a kind of Asian Castro. There even have been American efforts to try to discredit President Sukarno for his undeniably prodigious virility. Chatting with State Department officials a short time ago, they told me that the United States government is not going to play any prominent role in trying to persuade the Indonesians to stay at the United Nations. The Washington feeling is that while it would be too bad not to have the active participation of Mr. Sukarno's officials, it would hardly wreck the United Nations if Indonesia did not participate. This is Knowlton Nash reporting.
Canada tried immediately to get the Indonesians to change their minds. Our ambassador here, Paul Tremblay, talked to Mr. Pilar yesterday. They wouldn't say what they talked about, but it was obviously a plea by Mr. Tremblay for a change of heart. Canada has an interest in both sides in the dispute. When the UN helped to gain Indonesia's independence from the Dutch, Canada was on the Security Council and played an influential part. But we've also been helping the Malaysians. In Ottawa, Norman DePoe reports.
You couldn't exactly call it an air of tension around the East Bloc. It's nothing like the electric atmosphere at the time of the Cuban crisis, for example, but there is some tension and, above all, gloom. Ottawa sees the threatened withdrawal of Indonesia from the United Nations as just one more blow, and possibly a heavy one, to an organization that's already reeling under the antagonisms over financing, over the ugly split between Africa and the West, about the rescue operation in the Congo, over a good many other things. We've always supported the UN idea. We've hoped to expand it. Now it seems the UN has reached its blackest hour since at least that tense time when the General Assembly managed to keep the peace when the Security Council did not. But here's the Canadian mood and the Canadian approach as they were expressed by the Minister for External Affairs, Mr. Martin, when I talked to him a few hours ago.
How do you see the situation according to your information from the UN?
Well, at the moment, on two fronts, there is a reason for some concern. First of all, there is the notice of intention by the government of Indonesia to withdraw from the United Nations. At the moment, the effect has not been given to this, and I'm hoping that at the last moment the Indonesian government will reconsider its position and will act on the suggestion of the Secretary General that has been strongly supported by many countries. It would be very regrettable if this action were taken. On the finance side, the situation in the United Nations continues to be, I would say perhaps today, more unsatisfactory than it has been since the opening of the General Assembly on December the 10th.
Do you think the announcement of Indonesia's intended withdrawal raises any real fear of the United Nations breaking up?
No, I wouldn't say that, but I will say this, that unless we are going to be able to resolve the financial problem represented by the indebtedness of certain countries like the Soviet Union, the United Nations is going to be crippled. And if there were many acts, irresponsible acts, of withdrawal, this would certainly have an unsettling effect. I don't think the United Nations is going to come to an end by any means, but I do say that it is faced now with one of its gloomiest periods.
Do you think the dispute between Indonesia and Malaysia, the Indonesian threat to crush Malaysia, should be brought before the Security Council as a threat to world peace?
Well, any situation that does involve the peace of the world or threatens the peace is a matter that, under proper circumstances, should be placed before the Security Council. It would be regrettable, however, if Indonesia were not a member of the United Nations. This could not be done. I offer this as a consideration in addition to the one that naturally arises in my mind when we speak of the desirability of pursuing the universal objectives of the United Nations itself.
Indonesia has been described as a creature of the United Nations. It was under UN auspices that the nation was set up. Do you feel that a declaration by the United Nations would have a moral effect on Indonesia, or might the United Nations consider sanctions against Indonesia?
Well, this latter is possible, but sanctions are not easy to apply, and I would think that a more effective method would be the effective of persuasion, and this is being resorted to, and I am hopeful that at this date, at this time, there will be a reconsideration of the Indonesian action.
We have had, Canada's been very active on 3 fronts in this question, and I hope that as a result of the actions of the Secretary General of Canada and other countries, that this regrettable and unwise step will not be pursued.
Britain, Australia, and New Zealand have taken a new look at their commitments to Malaysia, military commitments.
Yes.
Is there any suggestion that Canada might participate in the defense of Malaysia?
Well, we had a military mission go to Malaysia recently, following the visit of the Prime Minister of Malaysia to Canada. That military mission has returned, and its recommendations are now being prepared and studied. The recommendations will not involve the use of manpower. There has been no request by the government of Malaysia for Canadian troops, and the Prime Minister has indicated in the House of Commons that the use of troops in Canada, or from Canada, in Asia, would only be pursuant to an obligation arising under the Charter of the United Nations.
Have you had a chance to talk personally with the Indonesian ambassador here?
Yes, I had him in to see me this morning.
And what did his attitude indicate?
Well, it would not be fair for me to say what he said to me, but I indicated to him our concern, as our ambassador in New York did on Sunday to Mr. Pallar, the Indonesian delegate who used to be ambassador in Canada, and as Mr. Ronald MacDonald, our ambassador in Jakarta, was instructed to do today.
We invited both UN ambassadors of Indonesia and Malaysia to be here tonight. Only one was able to attend. Here in the studio, Ambassador Ramani of Malaysia. Ambassador, I imagine your country could easily sustain the loss of Indonesia from the United Nations, but don't you think it would cripple the effectiveness if large countries like that started to leave holus bolus?
I think in the existing controversy between Indonesia and Malaysia, it will be a little more complicated if we should lose her from the United Nations. If no problems existed between Indonesia and ourselves, it would not matter if she were in or out. But now that problems have developed and are in being, it is far easier to deal with them when she is in rather than when she is out. And therefore, to that extent, her having gone out of the United Nations or having threatened to go out of the United Nations is a matter of some concern to us. Undoubtedly, under the Charter, the fact that a member state ceases to be a member state or that a state is not a member of the United Nations is no impediment in the way the United Nations organs with regard to peacekeeping, having control and getting them to be amenable to the jurisdiction. And therefore, if we should choose to bring another complaint before the Security Council, it should be entirely competent. The Security Council would do it or not is a different matter. For the Security Council to take the necessary steps to discipline Indonesia, if the Security Council were minded to do so.
Mr. Ambassador, why do you think President Sukarno wants to crush Malaysia? What's he after?
The simplest and the most honest answer would be, I wish I knew. These reasons have been ever multiplying in the mouths of the leaders of Indonesia. That time after time that one is faced with so many problems being posed, so many reasons being given, which are convenient for the occasion. For instance, this doctrine, this dogma of neo-colonialism invented by the communists in Indonesia, which is now being played about a great deal. This seems to be an ever-expanding doctrine which will take a multitude of people and ideas under its cover. I mean, that is what we are told is being the real charge.
But you really don't know.
Has against.
What kind of a man do you think President Sukarno is?
Well, I'm afraid it would be wrong for me to judge him. I've only heard of him. I've not even seen him. But one gets the impression from what one reads about him is that he's a man supremely self-confident, inclined to be very stubborn, most anxious to throw his weight about, and incapable of finding an equal to his own stature close to himself. He wants to be right at the top of the world all the lifetime.
Does your country anticipate a full-scale invasion from Indonesia?
Well, yes and no. It fears an invasion. It doesn't anticipate one because we are very much aware that there has been a tremendous build-up of forces along the Borneo borders. But at the same time, even making every allowance for the irrational and unpredictable ways in which Sukarno behaves, even Sukarno would be conscious of the fact that he cannot embark on large-scale invasion and get away with it to any quick results. He is bound to be ultimately defeated, even without the assistance of anyone except the British and the Australians and the New Zealanders.
President Sukarno said that he would crush Malaysia before the cock crows on January the 1st. It's now January the 5th.
Well, this is a question that somebody should ask President Sukarno.
One final question, sir. Will Indonesia stay out of the United Nations?
I think Indonesia, having taken this decision, I'm merely guessing, would want to give the impression to the world how firm she is in her resolve, how well motivated and well reasoned her attitudes are. But in time to come, she will come back, and she will want to create the occasion by which she would want to come back.
Thank you very much, sir. This week, the Indonesian ambassador goes home to Jakarta. The official reason is that he'll get further instructions. That phrase covers a lot of ground, and the hope at the UN is that he'll return with permission to work out a deal that will save face for his country and avoid a damaging body blow to the World Organization. 700 million Chinese